It's a great honor to be here with Ambassadors Adamishin and Brightway, and let me express my thanks to Nick and Catherine and Jill for everything. Anatoly was a wonderful friend whose hospitality helped facilitate my writing a dissertation, which is now a book, and it's on his counsel, his wise counsel, that I'm supposed to lead off by saying that the views I express here today are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the Department of State or the United States government. Let me try to get at some of the points that Ambassador Brightway was talking about in terms of what were the Americans up to, what was Reagan up to. The title of my paper here is The Reagan Administration in Between Brezhnev and Gorbachev, and my basic contentions are that individuals within the Reagan administration, most notably George Shultz and Jack Matlock, crafted strategies of engagement during this period from November 82 to March 85, and that this was a sort of reorientation of Washington's outlook toward the Soviet Union even before the arrival of Gorbachev. The period was crucial because Reagan was always ambivalent. As Ambassador Brightway says, he was not consistent. He was ambivalent, I argue in my own book, when it came to the Soviet Union. He wanted both to eradicate communism and abolish nuclear weapons. And that goes back a long ways in his mind throughout his political career. There's a basic contradiction there because in order to reduce nuclear weapons or abolish nuclear weapons, the US had to deal with the Soviet Union. Reagan did not trust Soviet leaders to adhere to their agreements, such as SALT, ABM, or the Helsinki Accords. Nonetheless, as president, he still reached out to Leonid Brezhnev, the man who had signed on to those agreements. Shortly after the assassination attempt in March of 1981, Reagan wrote a handwritten letter to Brezhnev about the time they had met 10 years earlier. Reagan writes, "When we met, I asked if you were aware that the hopes and aspirations of millions of people throughout the world were dependent on the decisions that you would reach in your meetings with President Nixon, after which you took my hand in both of yours and assured me that you were aware of that and that you were dedicated with all your heart and mind to fulfilling those hopes and dreams. It is in this spirit, in the spirit of helping the people of both our nations," the president went on to say, "that I have lifted the grain embargo. Perhaps this decision will contribute to creating the circumstances which will lead to the meaningful and constructive dialogue which will assist us in fulfilling our joint obligation to find lasting peace." Reagan wrote subsequent letters along those lines to Brezhnev, to Andropov, and Chernenko, and even when he gave hardline speeches, even when he said that the Soviet Union was an evil empire, even after the imposition of martial law in Poland in December of 81, in the spring of 82, when there was the opening of the United Nations Conference on Disarmament in New York City, at the very moment Ambassador Brightway is talking about, where there was a huge demonstration in New York against a nuclear buildup in favor of nuclear freeze, Reagan considered and wanted to meet with Brezhnev. And you can find, in the first of our volumes coming out from the State Department, the Foreign Relations series, the first one that will come out in January, you will see the kind of memos of people within the administration saying we need to make sure the president does not get too enticed by the concept of a summit at this point, of a concept of meeting with Brezhnev in a high-profile setting, because it's not time yet. But the president always wanted to do these things. He wanted to engage the Soviets from the very start. Even then, when he goes to Westminster in June of 82 and talks about the March of Freedom and Democracy, which will leave Marxist-Leninism on the ash heap of history, as it has left other tyrannies which stifle the freedom and muzzle the self-expression of the people. Hardliners such as Caspar Weinberger William Casey and William Clark, who had known the president a long time, welcomed this type of rhetoric. They clashed with Al Haig, whose bombast notwithstanding was much more attuned to the concerns of transatlantic partners. Now, an important thing, I think, to ponder when it comes to Reagan and trust and Gorbachev and Geneva and diplomatic success is that Reagan rarely gave clear orders to his subordinates, and he did not, very rarely ever intervene to halt the bickering among these people around him. In the fall of '81, for instance, Reagan called up a Washington journalist to deny that there would be any personnel changes forthcoming. He said that Al Haig was the best Secretary of State we've had in a long time. He called in Al Haig, he called in his National Security Advisor, Richard Allen, and ordered a, quote, halt to the sniping. Now, that was about as clear as he got, and within 6 months of that meeting, both of these men had left the administration. Most importantly was the departure of Al Haig, who was replaced by George Shultz in the summer of 1982. Haig had been, I would say, a moderate compared to most of the Reagan officials surrounding him, but he also was somebody who blamed Moscow for abetting the Baader-Meinhof gang that had attempted to kill him when he was Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. And George Shultz did not have this type of Cold War framework in his mind. It wasn't a sort of personal vendetta to him. As Secretary of the Treasury, he had traveled to Moscow and Leningrad, where he had seen evidence of the 900-day siege of Leningrad during the war. He wrote, "I had learned something of the human dimension to the Soviet Union. He learned that the Soviets were tough negotiators, but that you could negotiate successfully with them. Their diplomats were smart and unflappable. I respected them not only as able negotiators, but as people who could make a deal and stick to it." Shultz wanted to engage these Soviet counterparts. He was assisted shortly after he came in by the arrival of Jack Matlock, who replaced Richard Pipes, the author of Team B, and someone who did think that the Soviets were capable of waging a nuclear war. Jack Matlock replaced him as the top Soviet advisor on the National Security Council staff. There was a formal Soviet strategy on the part of the Reagan administration called NSDD 75. It set forth such goals as to contain and over time reverse Soviet expansionism by competing effectively on a sustained basis with the Soviet Union in all international eras. It goes on from there. This was the document that Pipes had written before he departed. Now, the apparent distinction between NSDD 5 and previous strategies was, quote, to promote within the narrow limits available to us the process of change in the Soviet Union toward a more pluralistic political and economic system in which the power of the privileged ruling elite is gradually reduced. Now, a number of authors or historians have pointed to some of this language to say that there was a strategy from all along for the Reagan administration to destroy the Soviet Union, and I don't agree at all with that interpretation. The same week that Reagan signed NSDD 75, George Shultz sent him a memorandum titled U.S.-Soviet Relations in 1983. And instead of talking about containing and reversing Soviet expansionism through military and international pressure, it called for countering the, quote, new Soviet activism by starting an intensified dialogue with Moscow to advance realism and mutual interests. And Shultz was vilified by the old line Reagan friends. National Security Advisor William Clark called him up to express disapproval, and Shortly thereafter, Shultz managed to sneak in Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to meet Reagan face to face in early 1983, after which Reagan writes in his diaries, "We talked for 2 hours. Sometimes we got nose to nose. I told him I wanted George Shultz to be a channel for direct contact with Andropov, no bureaucracy involved." Later that year, Shultz testifies to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as testimony helped by Jack Matlock, and he laid out a sort of four-part framework for negotiations with the Soviet Union, bilateral affairs, human rights, arms control, multilateral affairs. And in the fall of '83, the tense fall of '83, you have the deployment of INF, you have the KLL 007, you have anxieties over exercises. Jack Matlock starts a Saturday morning informal seminar for NSC principals to refine Soviet policies and establish long-term priorities. It had nothing to do with destroying the Soviet Union. It had to do with restarting arms negotiations and finding common themes for stability. He was drafting the speech that Reagan gave about Ivan and Anya in January '84. Matlock had been working on that even before the sort of potential war scare that fall. And throughout '84, even when there are no high-level arms control negotiations, what you see in the U.S. kind of internal records, at least, is a real battle between Caspar Weinberger and George Shultz about whether we should be working to restart arms negotiations, whether arms negotiations were ever in the U.S. interest in the Cold War. And let me just close by saying that there was an interesting few weeks to me is in the summer of 1984, where the Reagan administration gets a kind of overture from Chernenko for restarting negotiations. I think that would be in Vienna, specifically devoted to anti-satellite or anti-space weapons. And to the chagrin of Caspar Weinberger, Shultz and an incredibly important individual that nobody really has ever heard about, named Jim Timby, who has been the top U.S. arms control guru in the State Department since 1972, and was, up all night at Reykjavik and up all night earlier this year in Geneva. He and Timby kind of craft this three-track proposal that would become the umbrella talks that would start in early 1985. So you would have START, INF, and the defense and space negotiations. And it was a way of ensuring that no matter what happened politically, whether there was another event like the shoot-down of the Korean airliner, you would always have, you would ensure that both sides would have to return to these umbrella talks, these three tracks in Geneva. And that lasted until 1991, and it created a kind of structure in which these incredible events played out. It meant to de-link the different components of the Cold War, and it was extraordinarily successful at setting up trust. Let me just say, finally, the one last point. It has to do with something that Ambassador Brightweight raised. I think first of all, I think the concerns about Minutemen vulnerability, however irrational they may have seemed as an outsider at the time, however rational it may seem looking back for historians, that the concerns were real both for Reagan administration officials and Carter administration officials. And at the very least, in thinking about this period, we have to confront that reality, that the people in the room believed what they were hearing. I think that it was that perception of threat, the incredible frustration over MX basing. And one of the things that's a sad irony, or funny, I guess, for historians, is that the Carter administration, the Reagan administration has all the same arguments about MX basing after they have come in and scrapped whatever Carter did. I mean, they spend 2 or 3 years just literally having the exact same arguments about different bizarre basing proposals. But I do think that it's MX and the demonstrations that leads Reagan to announce SDI in March of '83. I do believe in that kind of causality, that he's so afraid of the nuclear freeze movement that would imperil what he thought was a strategic modernization that needed to happen, that is what determines the timing. And that I also think, notwithstanding these ridiculous psychological operations in terms of probing the Soviet perimeter, which, yes, were ridiculous and unhelpful, but I don't think that SDI was a psychological operation. And I think that's an important distinction because the perception at the time, and still probably the still perceptions, was that this was a way, the whole thing was a way of messing with the Soviets' minds. At least from Reagan's perspective, SDI was going to be the solution to the nuclear terror and the kind of mutual vulnerability that both he and Gorbachev faced. And then everyone around Reagan, it became a kind of shibboleth that they had to say, well, we support SDI. And of course, Schultz and Weinberger had different understandings of what SDI would achieve.